In 1903, by executive order, President Theodore Roosevelt set aside Pelican Island in Florida as the nation's first bird reservation. While it wasn't the first piece of federal land to be protected in the United States, it was the first unit in what would eventually become the National Wildlife Refuge System, which today covers more than 1.5 million acres. And as bird reservations were being created all over the country, there was one particularly remote part of American territory that needed special protection. In the Pacific, bird poaching for birds' feathers was wiping out entire species, and the U.S. had remote island territories that were in desperate need not just of protection, but also of systematic scientific inquiry. In 1909, by executive order, Theodore Roosevelt created the Hawaiian Islands Reservation for the protection of native birds, and that would drive an extraordinary set of scientific and anthropological expeditions to some of the world's most remote islands. The Tanager expeditions of 1923 and 1924 involved some of the most important natural scientists in the United States at the time. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Theodore Roosevelt had been a Western rancher and an avid hunter before becoming president after the death of William McKinley, who was the victim of an assassin's bullet. His reputation was so wild, in fact, that when McKinley died, Ohio Senator Mark Hanna famously said of Roosevelt, "Look, now that damned cowboy is president of the United States." But being a cowboy who recognized the damage that poor conservation of land and wildlife had done to ranching was an essential part of Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. He was called the conservationist president and used his authority to protect wildlife and public lands, establishing 150 national forests, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 51 federal bird reserves. During his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt protected approximately 230 million acres of public land. Included in those was the Hawaiian Islands Reserve for the protection of native birds. When the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898, the annexation included not just the 8 inhabited islands, but a chain of islets that extended some 1,300 miles. Created in 1909, the reserve, which was later renamed the Hawaiian Islands National Wildlife Refuge, was established to provide legal protection for the millions of seabirds inhabiting these northwestern Hawaiian islands. Writing in the journal Marine Ornithology in 1998, D.H.R. Spinneman of Charles Sturt University explained, "At the turn of the century, the uninhabited atolls of the Central Pacific Ocean were visited by Japanese feather collectors, whose actions devastated their seabird populations. An assessment of the historic record shows that between 1897 and 1914, over 3.5 million seabirds were killed on islands in the Central Pacific Ocean in the name of fashion for the millinery trade." When the revenue cutter Thetis apprehended a group of Japanese bird poachers on Laysan Island in 1910, they confiscated the feathers and wings of over 250,000 birds. The responsibility for managing this massive new bird sanctuary fell to the U.S. Biological Survey, which was part of the Department of Agriculture. And among the challenges they faced is the fact that the northwestern Hawaiian Islands chain had never been the subject of systematic scientific inquiry. There hadn't even been a thorough ornithological study to determine exactly what birds the bird sanctuary was protecting. The idea for an expedition to do that sort of study involved some of the most important natural scientists in the nation. The National Research Council was founded within the National Academy of Sciences in 1916 against the backdrop of the First World War, which at the time threatened to involve the United States. In response to growing concerns about the lack of American preparedness, the National Academy of Sciences wanted a national organization for the coordination of scientific and technological research and development. The Council, in turn, created a Committee on Pacific Investigations. The purpose of the committee was to encourage research undertakings in the Pacific area, which offered not just opportunities in biological sciences and anthropology, but also potential navigational and military applications related to the U.S.'s remote Pacific Island territories. The committee met in Honolulu in 1920, and the discussions there prompted Herbert E. Gregory, a Yale geologist and director of the Bernice P. Bishop Museum in Honolulu, to propose a scientific expedition. The Bernice P. Bishop Museum was founded in 1889 by Charles Reed Bishop, a New Yorker who had moved to Hawaii and become a successful businessman and philanthropist. He had married into the Hawaiian royal family and had funded the museum when his wife, Bernice Pauhai Paki, the last legal heir of the Kamehameha dynasty, died, to house her family's heirlooms. In 1920, the museum held the world's largest collection of Polynesian artifacts. Herbert Gregory saw a joint scientific expedition to the islands of the bird reserve as a way to enhance the museum's collection. First, Gregory, himself a renowned geologist famous for mapping the bedrock geology of the Colorado Plateau, needed to enlist the support of the renowned naturalist Edward William Nelson. Nelson had been involved in expeditions from Alaska to California's Death Valley and had several species named after him. And in 1920, he was the director of the Biological Survey. Nelson appreciated the importance of such an expedition to the Biological Survey, but he also worried about funding, arguing that appropriations for the Biological Survey from Congress were only for specific purposes. But he realized that this expedition would become much more viable if he involved another unit of the U.S. federal government. The ship for the expedition would be provided by the United States Navy. Nelson knew that there was a strong argument that the Navy had much to gain from an investigation of these islands that were so close to their Pacific base at Pearl Harbor. Moreover, Nelson hoped that by involving the Navy, he would be able to meet another goal of the Biological Survey, and that is to expand the expedition beyond just those islands that were part of the bird reservation. In February 1923, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture wrote a formal request to the Secretary of the Navy, arguing that the expedition would result in the accumulation of considerable information valuable for the use of the Navy. The Navy assigned a Lapwing-class minesweeper to the expedition, one of 49 such vessels built during and after the First World War. Vessels of the Lapwing class were, appropriately for the expedition, named after bird species, in this case, the USS Tanager, giving the expedition its name. To the delight of both Nelson and Gregory, the Navy approved the use of the vessel not just to the islands of the bird reserve, but also to Midway Island, which was not included in the reserve as it was under contract to a telegraph company, and the outlying atolls of Wake and Johnston Islands, despite Wake being a nearly 2,000-mile voyage. The Tanager would be captained by 27-year-old Navy Lieutenant Commander Samuel Wilder King. King had attended the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, but had another unique qualification for the expedition. King had been born and raised in Hawaii, and was of native Hawaiian descent. 4 trips were planned for 1923. The agreement was that the Navy would be responsible for collecting and charting hydrographic data. The United States Biological Survey would provide an ornithologist, a specialist in the destruction of rabbits to eradicate an infestation on the island of Laysan, and a moving picture operator. The Bishop Museum would provide any other personnel that might be considered desirable. Alexander Wetmore, an ornithologist with the Biological Survey, was assigned as the lead scientist and responsible for the scientific team. The initial trip was to the northwestern Hawaiian islands of Laysan, Pearl and Hermes Atoll, Midway Atoll, and Kure Atoll. Biologist and wildlife photographer Donald R. Dickey was to accompany the expedition as the official photographer. A survey biologist from Arizona named Charles E. Reno was assigned to eradicate the rabbits. A handful of other scientists, including experts on insects and mollusks, rounded out the scientific team. In a historical footnote, one of the biologists provided by the survey, with expertise in ornithology and herpetology, was an Army officer named Chapman Grant, the grandson of former President Ulysses Grant. To illustrate the tight budget, the Secretary of Agriculture stipulated that subsistence expenses should not exceed $5 a day. That is approximately $26.50 per person in today's dollars for food. Laysan is small, a little over 900 acres. It was described as low-slung, often barely above sea level, and an important destination for birds of the Pacific. A particular concern on the island was rabbits. As a destination for birds, the island had been rich in bird guano, used for fertilizer. The guano had been removed by commercial interests, but they had left behind an ecological disaster. Someone had brought 2 pairs of rabbits to the island, hoping they would become a supply of food. The rabbits bred like, well, rabbits, but the population stayed in check while the guano was being mined as they were hunted for food. But when the guano ran out and the miners left, the population soared. The Biological Survey had already tried to eradicate them, but did not get them all. The rabbits ate all the vegetation, which both denied food to other wildlife, but also made life on the island almost unbearable from blowing sand. Nelson hoped the expedition, which would be given a month to eliminate the pest, would solve the problem once and for all. He wrote to Charles Reno, "The destruction of rabbits on Laysan is a very important matter. I hope you will be able to actually exterminate the last rabbit on the island during the month which we have devoted to that purpose. Failure to do so would be a great disappointment to me and would necessitate another effort at considerable expense." To support the endeavor, the survey provided Reno with 125 ounces of strychnine, 2 tons of alfalfa to poison with the strychnine, 4 .22 caliber rifles, and 15,000 rounds of ammunition. The rabbits, which had likely caused the extinction of multiple native flora and fauna, were successfully eliminated after more than a month of effort. The island, once described as literally covered by myriad sea birds, was nearly barren. Wetmore said in National Geographic magazine, "From all appearances, Laysan might have been a desert." Laysan still represents a cautionary tale about the impact of invasive species. It was on Laysan that the expedition witnessed a rare and tragic event. The Laysan honey creeper, a species unique to the island, had been driven to near extinction, as the rabbits had consumed nearly all of the plants from which the birds could derive nectar. When the expedition arrived, just 3 specimens were found. A strong storm hit while the expedition was on the island, and after, the scientists were able to confirm that all 3 had succumbed to the storm. In a rare event, scientists had actually been present to witness the extinction of a species. This brief film by Donald Dickey represents the last photographic evidence of a beautiful species. At least 2 other bird species, once common on the island, had also been driven to extinction by the rabbit devastation, the Laysan millibird and the Laysan rail. The expedition collected a massive amount of biological samples. On Laysan alone, they picked up 8 boxes containing seal skulls and skeletons, seal skins, bird skeletons, and eggs, small bird and mammal skins. Further expeditions in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands discovered not just new species of birds and plants, but hundreds of anthropological sites representing Polynesian culture. The sites were cleared and mapped, and artifacts, including human remains, were taken to the Bishop Museum. The discoveries resulted in another trip in 1924 to further investigate the archaeological sites on the island of Nihoa, which once was home to a native Polynesian population of several hundred. 2 ships were taken for the expeditions to Wake Island and Johnston Atoll, with the Lapwing-class USS Whippoorwill joining the Tanager. The thorough surveys of the islands not only served vital military purposes, as both islands would prove important during the Second World War, but offered a unique opportunity, as both islands were so changed by the war that had the expedition not gone at this time, we would likely have no understanding of the original environments, flora and fauna, of those islands. Despite the significance of the discoveries, publication of the findings of the expeditions has been comparatively light, limited largely to an article in the July 1925 edition of National Geographic. That has largely been attributed to the fact that Alexander Wetmore, who had overall responsibility for publishing the results, went through a number of rapid career changes and advancements shortly after the expedition. Still, the discoveries were published slowly over time and offered an unprecedented new understanding of the ecology of these remote islands and proven invaluable in ongoing conservation efforts. In addition to the scientific discoveries and military applications, the expedition included some of the most important naturalists in America, who among them have dozens of species named in their honor, authored hundreds of journal articles, and became leaders in their fields. In 1924, the superintendent of the National Zoological Park died suddenly, and Alexander Wetmore was chosen to replace him. After just a few months in that position, he was appointed assistant secretary at the Smithsonian Institution and placed in charge of the U.S. National Museum. He would go on to become secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Considered one of the most important naturalists of the era, some 56 new genera, species, and subspecies of birds, insects, mammals, mollusks, amphibians, and 1 plant bear scientific names given in his honor. He passed away in 1978. Donald Ryder Dickey, a noted and prolific biologist and scientist, would be recognized as one of the greatest nature photographers in history. He collected some 50,000 specimens and produced more than 7,500 photographs and moving images of natural subjects. He passed away in 1932. At his death, his collection of bird and mammal specimens was the largest private collection in the United States. Chapman Grant was a founder of the Herpetologist League, founded the journal Herpetologica, and published the journal Scientist Forum. 2 species of West Indian snakes were named in his honor. He passed away in 1983. Samuel Walter King, captain of the Tanager, became the territorial governor of Hawaii in 1953. He was the first native Hawaiian to become governor of the territory. A species of miller bird discovered on the expedition was named in his honor. He passed away in 1959. Kenneth Pike Emery of the Bishop Museum was the anthropologist who cataloged the sites on Nihoa and became one of the preeminent anthropologists regarding Oceania. He was a leader who helped to shape the field of anthropology over a 70-year career. He passed away in 1992. In 1997, as a result of the 1990 Native American Remains Protection and Repatriation Act, the Polynesian remains that had been discovered by the expedition on Nahoa Island were removed from the Bishop Museum and reburied on Nahoa by the native Hawaiian group Hui Malama. One of the scientific stars of the expedition was the U.S. Biological Survey, which eventually became the National Fish and Wildlife Service, and today employs more than 9,000 people, protecting some 1.5 million acres from 700 field stations. Continuing efforts by the service have helped to reestablish bird populations on Laysan. In 2006, President George Bush, by executive order, gave the northwestern Hawaiian Islands national monument status. The Papahuka Mokaeke National Marine Monument, covering some 580,000 square miles, is among the largest protected areas in the world. On September 2nd, 1796, the Boston-based brig Sally accidentally grounded on a remote shoal in the Pacific Ocean. The Sally's captain, John Pierpont, recounted the events a year later, including that shoal's location, and that seems to have been the first Western discovery of that particular tiny Pacific atoll. Later, one of the two islands of the atoll was named Johnston Island, after the name of a British sea captain who also recorded the location of the islands, although the local name for the island was Iwipo'omakapuni. This atoll was remote. The islands were tiny. They had no human population and didn't even have a fresh water source. It was an unlikely place to develop a rich history that deserves to be remembered. The atoll was created some 70 million years ago as underwater volcanic eruptions built up layers of basalt. Geologically, the islands anchored the northern end of the Line Islands Ridge. Over time, the island eroded beneath the surface, but corals around its fringes grew and eventually created a limestone cap thousands of feet thick on top of the ancient volcano. The area is a shallow coral platform of some 50 square miles. The first commercial exploitation of Johnston Island was for its bird poo, used for fertilizer, one of more than 100 islands claimed under the 1856 U.S. Guano Islands Act. The Kingdom of Hawaii also claimed the island, naming it Kalana. King Kamehameha IV declared the island to be part of his kingdom in July 1856. However, the Kingdom of Hawaii never tried to economically exploit the island, even as the bird poo was being mined away, and the dispute became irrelevant after Hawaii was annexed to the United States in 1898. The island was mapped and surveyed as part of the wide-ranging Tanager expedition in 1923, named after the Navy ship USS Tanager, which did a thorough biological survey. Partly as a result of the survey, in 1926, President Calvin Coolidge declared Johnston Island and tiny sand island next to it a bird refuge, the Johnston Island Reservation for the protection of native birds. The purpose of the protection was largely to combat poachers who killed native birds for their feathers, used in the fashion and millinery trade. But at the time, the Department of Agriculture, which had responsibility for the refuge, had no ships that could be used to visit the remote atoll. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt moved administration of the island to the Navy, subject, however, to the use of said Johnston and Sand Islands by the Department of Agriculture as a refuge and breeding ground for native birds. The change in administration was partly because, unlike the Department of Agriculture, the Navy actually had ships that could visit Johnston Island, but it was also because the Navy had developed an interest in the atoll for strategic purposes. The Navy began using the islands quickly, and in 1935 began construction of a seaplane base on Sand Island. The base required some coral blasting to clear the seaplane approach, and materials from coral blasting and dredging would be used to progressively expand the island. Eventually, Sand Island was extended into a seaplane base that could support a patrol squadron. The atoll had never had a human population before, but now suddenly tiny Sand Island had facilities for 400 people, including a mess hall, a hospital, water tanks, a radio station, and a control tower. The Navy also built a small parking area southwest of the island and connected the two via a causeway, the first of many changes that the military would make to the island's geography. Marine Jim Devine described the changes to Sand Island in 1944. Sand Island at the time consisted of two islands connected by a single-lane coral roadway about 600 feet long. The northeast island was natural, about 5 acres. The southwest island was completely dredged up from the sea and was about the size of a baseball diamond. It was about 18 inches out of high tide, and you could stand in the middle, throw a piece of coral, and hit the water. But the Navy had bigger plans for the larger nearby Johnston Island. In February 1941, with tensions in the Pacific high, President Roosevelt issued another executive order regarding Johnston Atoll, establishing both a Naval Defense Sea Area and a Naval Airspace Reservation. Only U.S. government ships and aircraft were allowed within the areas. Construction of a 4,000-foot by 500-foot runway and a base on Johnston Island began in September and was completed before December 7th. A ship channel was dredged with the material used to expand the island's area. The base was attacked by fire from Japanese submarines twice in December 1941, but was too close to Hawaii for the Japanese to consider an amphibious assault. Quickly, the war shifted west in the Pacific. As Devine put it, the war was about 1,500 miles west of us. That made for an interesting wartime experience. Devine described the horrors of war. The most horrific instances occurred when for one whole week we had no chocolate ice cream, only vanilla and strawberry because the ice cream machine broke down. Then the movie machine broke for a week, and a shark even got into our swimming area. While the Japanese caused no casualties on the atoll, there were a few deaths there, including 6 Seabees who died from bad moonshine they'd cooked up. In March of 1943, a consolidated Catalina PBY seaplane crashed on approach, killing all 10 crew members on board. But being far from the front does not mean that the island was not active. By 1944, Johnston Atoll was one of the busiest airport transport terminals in the Pacific, and the runway was extended to 6,000 feet and later to 9,000 feet. During the war, the island was used as an airfield, a base for anti-submarine patrols, a reconnaissance plane base, a communications station, and a ship and submarine refueling station. One of the island's anti-aircraft batteries had been destined for Wake Island before the island fell to the Japanese on December 23, 1941. By 1947, over 1,300 B-29 and B-24 bombers had passed through Johnston Island, being returned to the U.S. after the war. In 1948, administration of the island passed to the United States Air Force, and Johnston Island Air Force Base served the needs of both the Air Force and the Military Air Transportation Service. The importance of the island as a transportation hub increased again during the Korean War, and it was also used as a refueling stop for airplanes during the Vietnam War. Despite being well outside the line of fire for most of the war, Johnston's World War II experience was significant. Being developed into a base, with an airfield large enough to land the Air Force's biggest bombers, paths cleared through the coral to allow access to ships, and establish military-protected air and sea space would have a significant impact on the island's history. In the post-war world, a base with such facilities in such a remote location was of value to the United States. As Grace Plummer and Barbara Johnson, former Department of Energy employees on the island, described it, Little Johnston Atoll boasts a huge launch window, a wonderfully effective sea-cleaning lagoon, and is far away from inhabited spaces. Mike Kirby, who worked on the island in the 1970s, put it more bluntly. With no reporters allowed, the armed forces were free to run almost any kind of program on Johnston Island, with minimum oversight. Among those uses was as a navigational station. In 1958, a LORAN, or Long Range Navigational Station, operated by the U.S. Coast Guard, began operating. LORAN-A was a type of hyperbolic radio navigation in which a navigation receiver instrument on a ship or aircraft is used to determine location based on the difference in timing of radio waves received from fixed land-based radio navigation beacon transmitters. Establishing the transmitter at Johnston allowed better accuracy in determining the position of ships along an important transportation route. The Coast Guard operated a LORAN station on the atoll for 34 years, finally ending operation in July of 1992, by which time the advent of satellite navigation had reduced the need for the station. But Johnston also played a role in the nuclear arms race of the Cold War. Not only was the airfield an important transportation point between Hawaii and islands engaged in testing, but a handful of nuclear tests were conducted from the island. In 1958, the size of the island was expanded again using coral dredging and a launch facility established on the new ground. Operation Hardtack 1 was a series of nuclear tests in 1958 that included more nuclear detonations than the total of all prior nuclear explosions in the Pacific Ocean. 2 of those, high-altitude tests codenamed Teak and Orange, were approximately 3.8 megaton detonations from missiles launched from the Johnston Island Launch Facility in August 1958. This photo shows the brightness of the hardtack Teak explosion on August 1st, nearly 48 miles above the base. It was, however, tests during Operation Dominic in 1962 that would have a larger impact on the island's future. 9 missiles, 8 Thor intermediate range missiles and 1 Nike Hercules missile were launched from Johnston Island between May and November 1962. Fully 4 of those launches failed at different points, and 3 of those failures resulted in significant radiological contamination on the island. Most notably, the launch codenamed Bluegill Prime on July 25th occurred on the launch pad and resulted in explosions and fire that engulfed the missile and nuclear warhead. A 2016 report by the Air Force Safety Center Weapons Safety Division explained, extensive radioactive contamination to the launch pad occurred as a result of this launch failure. The Johnston Island Launch Complex was heavily damaged and contaminated with plutonium. Launches had to be halted until the radioactive debris could be dumped and the launch pad rebuilt. Troops were sent in to do a rapid cleanup, but repairs still took 3 months. In 2016, the Air Force noted, the radiological impacts of the Bluegill Prime launch failure invoked significant cleanup activities during Dominic 1 and for nearly 4 decades after the failures. Much of the contaminated area was covered up when the island was expanded through dredging a final time between 1962 and 1963, expanding the island, which initially encompassed 46 acres, to 596 acres, or about 1.06 square miles. The Dominic 1 launches from Johnston Island also included the July 8 Starfish Prime launch. The 1.4 megaton nuclear explosion at an altitude of some 250 miles created an electromagnetic pulse that was far larger than expected. So much so that it was difficult to measure as it threw the instruments off scale. The pulse was so significant that, according to the Associated Press, it knocked out power to traffic lights and telecommunications in parts of Honolulu, some 898 miles away, illuminating the sky and even leading hotels to host viewing parties. The results of the high-altitude test of Operation Dominic gave rise then to one of the more interesting parts of Johnston Island's history. Johnston Island was the base for the super-secret Operation 437. The operation had Johnston locating 2 Thor missiles at its launch facility as an anti-satellite weapons program. The PGM Thor ballistic missiles would carry W-50 nuclear warheads and were intended to explode in the high atmosphere and destroy enemy satellites with an electromagnetic pulse. Further facilities were built, and there were several test launches of modified Thor missiles, although without nuclear payloads. The program was inactivated in 1970, partly because the Air Force was afraid the pulse could destroy our own satellites as well. Johnston also housed part of the U.S. satellite tracking program, housing a Baker-Nunn camera satellite tracking station from 1965 to 1977. The camera used 50mm wide film derived from the CinemaScope 55 motion picture process and 20-inch aperture, allowing it to follow satellites in the sky. Already a part of several Cold War programs, Johnston was also used for the recovery of data from CIA reconnaissance satellites. The low Earth orbit satellites would drop capsules with film canisters. The capsules would be captured in midair by JC-130 aircraft based at Johnston Island and operated by the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office. And if nuclear testing and spy operations weren't enough, Johnston was also a part of the U.S. Biological Weapons Program. Johnston was one of the locations used for Project SHAD, Shipborne Hazard and Defense, intended to test U.S. warships' vulnerabilities from chemical and biological attacks. The test had specifically designed Navy warships and aircraft releasing a biological agent in the air to test in the sea environment on U.S. warships. Johnston Island was used for communication and agent preparation for one of the tests. The test used Bacillus goebiji, or Agent BG, on Navy ships, with many of the test subjects unaware that they were being tested. Agent BG was intended to stimulate a biological attack, but was thought at the time to have few health consequences. While the test helped to develop detection and decontamination procedures, Agent BG turned out to have much more significant health consequences than the Navy had anticipated. Details of the secret program didn't start to be released until 2002. In 1970, Johnston's remote location resulted in yet another use: chemical weapon storage. A high-security facility was built and stored tons of chemical weapons from throughout the world in both world wars, much of which had been previously stored at a U.S. base in Okinawa, Japan. Munitions included rockets, mines, and artillery projectiles, as well as containers of dangerous agents such as sarin, mustard gas, and the deadly nerve gas, VX. At its height, the island stored 6.6% of the U.S. chemical weapons stockpile. After 1972, 1.8 million gallons of herbicide orange, a defoliant used in the Vietnam War, which has been connected to significant health problems, was stored on the island in leaking barrels that contaminated both the storage area and the lagoon. Mike Kirby was an explosive ordnance demolition specialist that helped to move the infamous Agent Orange to the island. He said of Johnston at the time, "Not much on the island at the time. I was surprised to find there were 5 bars and numerous dogs running around." The herbicide orange was destroyed by incineration aboard a German incinerator ship. MV Vulcanus, in 1977. And in the final phase of the U.S. military operation on Johnston Atoll, between 1985 and 1986, the U.S. Army created its first chemical weapons disposal facility, the Johnston Atoll Chemical Agent Disposal System, or JCADS. In 1985, Congress mandated the demilitarization and destruction of all chemical agents on Johnston Atoll. And the new facility used mechanical procedures to demilitarize the weapons and incinerate the chemical and explosive agents. JCADS was the test facility for other Army projects to dispose of the U.S. chemical weapons stockpile. The destruction of the weapons on the island was completed in 2000, and the JCADS facility was demolished in 2003. In its 14 years of operation, JCADS destroyed more than 400,000 munitions and 4 million pounds of nerve and blister agents. In August of 2009, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency approved the final closure of the facility. Conrad F. Wine, director of the U.S. Army Chemical Material Agency, said at the time, "The men and women of the JCADS team and our EPA partners have made the chemical weapons of Johnston Atoll history. They have made the world a safer place." In 2005, Johnston Island was briefly put up for auction by the U.S. General Services Administration, billed as a potential residence or vacation getaway, but the ad was removed. Johnston Atoll has now been left to the birds and the occasional monk seal. The base has been closed, the buildings demolished, and the airfield decommissioned and no longer maintained. The atoll is a national wildlife refuge and officially closed to the public, although occasionally visited by vessels crossing the Pacific. Since 2010, the Fish and Wildlife Service have been working to eradicate an infestation of yellow crazy ants on the island. The little atoll was a centerpiece of some of the darkest projects of the Cold War, and yet now it's a wildlife refuge. Still, its history represents an era, not just in U.S. history and world history, but in the lives of the people who work there. As Grace Plummer and Barbara Johnson concluded, the little atoll that everyone and no one wanted housed thousands of civilian and military personnel in its time as a flash in the pan of national security. But it was a great flash, and many memories burn brightly. In July 1960, there were stories in two Miami, Florida newspapers regarding an almost comic story of an invasion of a tiny Caribbean island that housed a U.S. weather station. It all had to do with a little-known territorial dispute between the United States and Honduras over the tiny, only some 3-kilometer square Swan Islands chain about 95 miles off the coast of Honduras. And it would have been easy to miss the story, which quoted U.S. Weather Service personnel saying they couldn't understand why anybody would fight over these islands, and talked about a weaponless invasion that included an occupation of just some 7 hours. But at the time, the newspapers didn't really have the whole story, which was an interesting one of Cold War intrigue that definitely fits into the truth is stranger than fiction category. The early history of the islands is somewhat uncertain, although it appears Columbus probably visited there looking for firewood on his 4th voyage. But the name came from a pirate, because don't all great stories involve pirates? In 1683, a group of London merchants fitted out a ship called the Signet, which is the name for a young swan, and fittingly named a master mariner named Charles Swan the ship's captain. The goal was to establish trade with Peru and Chile, but on the trip, the Signet was attacked and overcome by pirates, who, Swan claimed, forced he and the Signet to join them. Swan sold the Signet's cargo and raided the coast of South America, but in 1686, having found little luck there as a pirate, Swan took his crew across the Pacific in search of Spanish galleons, noting in a letter that the ship ran so short on supplies that the crew had considered eating him. He escaped cannibalism, but was later killed in the Philippines. It's not really clear how Charles Swan's name came to be associated with these islands, since he mostly did his raiding in South America, and his connection to the islands might be totally one of legend, but the islands were said to be the haunt of pirates, and by 1775 were being referred to on maps as the Swan Islands. The uninhabited islands were claimed by John Valentine White of the Atlantic and Pacific Guano Company in 1858 under the Guano Islands Act, which allowed U.S. citizens to claim otherwise unclaimed islands that had deposits of bird guano used for fertilizer. The original Guano Company apparently went out of business, and the islands were claimed by Captain Alonzo Adams of Mobile, Alabama in 1893. The islands were then leased to the United Fruit Company, which planted coconut palms there. In 1923, Honduras made a claim to the islands, claiming to have inherited the rights based on initial Spanish discoveries in the 16th century. But by that time, the islands were only being used for occasional hurricane monitoring, and both countries simply maintained competing claims. The U.S. Weather Bureau first created a station on the largest of the chain, Great Swan Island, in 1938. In 1949, the island served briefly as a U.S. Department of Agriculture quarantine station for cattle being imported to the United States from Central America. The island continued, with a small contingent of employees of the U.S. Weather Service and the Federal Aviation Administration, and a few immigrants who raised cattle on the island, and competing claims by the U.S. and Honduras. The State Department considered the islands to be the property of a Boston family named Smith, apparently based on Adams's 1893 claim. In 1955, Hurricane Hilda blew over the islands and knocked down the remaining coconut palms that had been planted by the United Fruit Company. By 1960, weather station employees on Great Swan Island described the island as one long bore, with one employee telling the Miami News that there's absolutely nothing to do. We can't even get radio stations in the States. In 1960, members of the U.S. Geodetic Survey arrived at the island and conducted a census, counting 28 people. Those represented 5 U.S. government employees, manning the U.S. weather station and an FAA airline beacon, and the rest were natives who had immigrated from the Grand Caymans or Bahamas and were taking care of a few cattle. The report of a population on Great Swan then spurred the invasion in July. The story of the invasion, reported in the Miami Herald and the Miami News, was reported by a ham radio broadcaster on the island. The invasion party consisted of, depending upon the story, 13 or 17 Hondurans who came to the island to assert Honduran sovereignty. A spokesman for the FAA described the group as a bunch of college or high school kids and said apparently they were just students on a Sunday picnic. The spokesman went on to say they arrived in a banana boat, planted their flag, sang their national anthem, and took some photos of the ceremony. The spokesman concluded that they were just out for excitement and they are gone now. Our operations have not been disturbed in the least. And that might be just a humorous anecdote, except that there was rather more to it. Between the census in March and the invasion in July, the island population had actually doubled because of something called Radio Swan. Radio Swan was a station with a 50,000-watt transmitter that started broadcasting from Great Swan Island in May. The station was owned by the Gibraltar Steamship Company. The radio station acted as a regular commercial broadcaster, broadcasting in Spanish throughout the Caribbean. The station raised eyebrows given the island's proximity to Cuba, which had, in 1959, finally fallen to Fidel Castro. The station broadcast news, which could be picked up in Cuba, and that was critical of the Castro regime. Almost immediately after Radio Swan began broadcasting, Castro's government accused the station of being an agent of the U.S. government. An article in the Miami Herald on June 24th gave some credence to Castro's claim. The Gibraltar Steamship Company did not appear to have owned any steamships in around a decade, had no other active assets. Despite being theoretically under the jurisdiction of the Federal Communications Commission as the U.S. claimed sovereignty over the island, the station had not obtained a permit, and the FCC declined to comment. Company owners were tight-lipped or unavailable. However, the station manager opined that he did not believe that Gibraltar Steamship was a fronting for a U.S. government agency, and the State Department and the CIA claimed to have known almost nothing about the station. But of course, Swan Radio and the Gibraltar Steamship Company were a front operation for the Central Intelligence Agency, and in fact the station had been built as part of a secret operation authorized by Dwight Eisenhower to topple the Castro regime. The transmitter used had originally been used by Radio Free Europe. It had been transferred by U.S. Navy Seabees in a secret operation in March. The Seabees also erected 2 radio towers, built an operation facility based on Quonset huts, and cleared a small airfield. The role of the CIA in Radio Swan would become obvious in 1961, when the station used coded messages that pretty much everyone in the region recognized as supporting the Bay of Pigs invasion. And that, of course, changed the context of that student invasion in July of 1960. Because what at first appeared to be simply a friendly encounter between students and Weather Service employees was actually students stumbling on an island that was housing a secret CIA operation to topple the Castro regime, which created a potentially unstable situation. It also greatly concerned the CIA operatives on the island who were desperately radioing the headquarters, and in his 2012 book, An Air War on Cuba, author Daniel Walsh provided a transcript of those cables. The CIA officers on the island cabled asking for instructions and were told, "Give them plenty of beer and protect the family jewels," meaning, of course, the radio station. The station later cabled the CIA. Honduran ship on horizon. Beer on ice. And then talk to students. They confabbing. Have accepted beer. The students then began mixing some concrete, which they planned to use to make a big sign that says "Island belongs to Honduras," and, according to CIA operatives, started listening to Eartha Kitt albums and drinking their fifth beer. The students then performed the flag-raising ceremony that was later described in the Miami Herald, which the CIA operative on the island described as, "Students have just raised Honduran flag. I saluted." But then a potential crisis, as the operatives had to cable headquarters saying that the beer supplies were running low. But the operatives deftly handled the situation, reporting that they were now breaking out the rum, followed by, "These kids are great." Finally, they were able to cable that the operation was a success and the students had vacated the island. None too soon, it seems, as the operatives said that their liquor supplies were exhausted, but the family jewels were intact. But the situation was rather more dangerous than it sounds. The station represented a covert attempt to overthrow the Castro regime, and had the students discovered the nature of the facility, it could have revealed the planned Bay of Pigs invasion. By keeping the students on the beach, the CIA had averted what could have been a very dicey situation, as U.S. Marines were at the station, armed, and prepared to defend it. Radio Swan changed its format after the Bay of Pigs invasion, but continued operating, along with other stations broadcasting anti-Castro messages for the CIA, until 1968, when the transmitter was again moved for use in broadcasting CIA propaganda during the Vietnam War. The invasion became an annual event, with a few students visiting each year, sitting on the dock and drinking beer. Despite a State Department opinion that the U.S. had the better territorial claim on the islands and a federal ruling in their favor, in 1971 the U.S. dropped their claims to the islands and in a treaty ceded them to Honduras, although we did secure permission to continue to operate the weather station facility, which operated there into the 1980s. In 1989, the Honduran government named the Swan Islands a wildlife refuge, although a group called Fantasy International says that they are planning some eco-friendly tourism development on the islands. Today, the only permanent residents of the Swan Islands are a small Honduran naval detachment on Great Swan Island. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.